$2.3 trillion, that's not a typo. 20 years, 2,400 soldiers killed, 20,000 wounded. And on August 15th, 2021, the Taliban walked back into Kabul, exactly as they were when it started. Now here's the question nobody in Washington wants to answer. Was Afghanistan the exception or the pattern? Because when you line up Vietnam, Iraq, Cuba, Syria, and Afghanistan side by side, the answer is deeply uncomfortable. Today, we're going to look at that pattern honestly, not to attack America, not to celebrate its enemies, but because the most important thing any nation or any person can do is look at the scorecard without flinching. This is America's greatest failure in modern history. As the most powerful military nation on Earth, the U.S. consistently allocates massive defense budgets. For fiscal year 2027, a record $500 billion has been proposed for military spending. That's nearly 20% of all global military spending combined. It's roughly equal to the entire national budget of Canada. For context, the next closest nation, China, spends approximately $225 billion. America outspends it by more than double. So with that kind of firepower, financial and military, and why does the record look the way it does? Let's go through it, one by one. October 7th, 2001, 19 days after 9/11, the United States launched Operation Enduring Freedom. The mission: dismantle al-Qaeda, remove the Taliban, prevent Afghanistan from being used as a launch pad for terrorism. In the early weeks, it worked. Kabul fell within 2 months. Taliban forces scattered. The world applauded. Then came the long war. Washington decided removal wasn't enough. The mission expanded. Rebuild the country. Build schools. Build roads. Train an Afghan army. Create a democracy. At its peak, between 2010 and 2012, over 100,000 American troops were deployed simultaneously. Annual war costs hit $100 billion per year. The official government figure for the total war, $822 billion. But Brown University's Costs of War project, one of the most cited academic studies on the conflict, estimates the real total, including veterans' care, interest on war debt, and intelligence costs, exceeded $2.3 trillion. Nearly 3 times what the government reported. And the result? On August 15th, 2021, the Taliban entered Kabul without a fight. The Afghan army and the U.S. spent $88 billion training and equipping. It dissolved in days. Some units surrendered. Some simply went home. The government the U.S. had spent 2 decades building collapsed in less than 2 weeks. 20 years, $2.3 trillion. 2,400 soldiers killed, 20,000 wounded. Same government as when it started. That's not a military failure. That's a strategic failure at the highest level. February 5th, 2003. U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell stood before the United Nations Security Council. He held up a vial. He showed satellite images. He made the case. Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. It was, he later called it, a blot on his career. Because after the invasion, inspectors found nothing. No chemical weapon stockpiles, no biological weapons, no nuclear program. What they did find was that Iraq had actually abandoned its WMD programs in 1991, over a decade before the invasion. The CIA, the UN inspectors, even some voices inside the Bush administration had flagged doubts. But the decision had already been made. Now, to be fair, Saddam Hussein was removed. A brutal dictator was gone. But here's what it cost beyond the battlefield. The UK committed troops, but Parliament turned against it. Tony Blair's reputation never recovered. France refused. Germany refused. The traditional post-World War II alliance fractured publicly for the first time. NATO stepped back. Spain withdrew its forces after the 2004 Madrid bombings linked the war to domestic terrorism. The total U.S. cost of the Iraq War, officially $757 billion. Brown University puts the real figure, including long-term veteran care, closer to $1.9 trillion. Over 4,400 American soldiers were killed, more than 31,000 wounded. In the aftermath, the power vacuum left by Saddam's removal directly enabled the rise of ISIS, the Islamic State, which took over large swaths of Iraq and Syria by 2014. The U.S. then had to go back in to fight ISIS, a war to clean up the consequences of a war. Today, when any politician in any Western country proposes military action in the Middle East, there is one phrase that ends the conversation. We don't want another Iraq. That is the real cost, not money, not even lives. America's credibility as a trustworthy global actor. Before Iraq, before Afghanistan, there was Vietnam. And Vietnam didn't just cost America a war. It cost America a belief. The belief that military superiority always wins. After World War II, the US emerged as the undisputed global superpower. It had the bomb. It had the economy. It had the confidence. When communist forces in North Vietnam began pushing south in the 1950s and 60s, Washington's logic was simple. We have the most powerful military on Earth. This will not take long. It took 20 years. At its peak, 543,000 American troops were deployed in Vietnam simultaneously. The US dropped more bombs on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia than were dropped by all sides combined in all of World War II. And yet, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army held. They used tunnel networks, jungle terrain, and sheer willpower to absorb losses that would have broken any conventional army. Then came January 31st, 1968, the Tet Offensive. In a single coordinated strike, North Vietnamese forces attacked over 100 cities and outposts across South Vietnam simultaneously, including a breach of the US Embassy in Saigon. Until that moment, the American public had been told the war was being won. General Westmoreland had testified before Congress just months earlier that there was light at the end of the tunnel. After Tet, nobody believed that anymore. By 1973, facing a collapsing domestic consensus, congressional opposition, and a military stretched to its limits, the U.S. withdrew. 58,282 American soldiers were killed. The financial cost, approximately $686 billion at the time, equivalent to nearly $1 trillion today. But here's the deeper wound. Vietnam was the first time the entire world watched America lose live on television, and it raised a question that has never fully gone away. Is military dominance the same as strategic wisdom? If Afghanistan is America's longest war, Cuba is America's longest embarrassment, and it's happening 90 miles from Florida. After the Spanish-American War of 1898, the U.S. played a central role in Cuba gaining independence. For decades, American businesses, hotels, and organized crime ran significant parts of the Cuban economy. Then, on January 1st, 1959, Fidel Castro's revolution succeeded. He nationalized American companies, aligned with the Soviet Union, and made Cuba the first communist state in the Western Hemisphere. April 17th, 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion. Approximately 1,400 CIA-trained Cuban exiles landed on Cuba's southern coast, expecting a popular uprising to support them. It never came. Within 72 hours, the operation collapsed completely. Over 1,100 fighters were captured. The Kennedy administration was humiliated globally. Nikita Khrushchev called it a tragic lesson. Even allies questioned American judgment. Since then, the strategy shifted to economic strangulation, sanctions, embargoes, travel bans. The U.S. embargo on Cuba is one of the longest running in modern history. The results in Cuba have been devastating. Food shortages, medical supply crises, economic collapse. The Cuban people have suffered enormously. And yet, as of today, Cuba's socialist government remains in power. 65 years and counting. This isn't just a foreign policy failure. It's a case study in what happens when a strategy is kept in place long after the evidence shows it isn't working, simply because changing course would feel like admitting defeat. In 2011, the Arab Spring reached Syria. Protests against President Bashar al-Assad's government turned violent. Assad responded with military force. The country descended into civil war. By 2013, the Obama administration authorized covert CIA operations, funneling weapons and training to opposition forces under what became known as Operation Timber Sycamore. The program ultimately cost over $1 billion and trained thousands of fighters. The results were mixed at best. Some US-backed groups dissolved, others defected. Some weapons ended up in the hands of extremist factions. Meanwhile, ISIS emerged from the chaos and seized territory across eastern Syria and Iraq, prompting a separate U.S. military intervention starting in 2014. Russia entered in 2015 to support Assad. Iran sent forces and proxies. Syria became a proxy war involving nearly every major global power simultaneously. In October 2019, President Trump announced a sudden withdrawal of U.S. forces from northern Syria. Kurdish fighters, America's primary ground partner against ISIS, were left exposed. Turkey immediately launched a military offensive against them. Allies were furious. Even Republican senators openly condemned the move. By late 2024, the Assad government had collapsed under pressure from a coalition of opposition forces. But large portions of Syria remain under Kurdish control, factional influence, and contested governance. The U.S. objective, a stable, democratic Syria, was never achieved. It was never clearly abandoned either. That's the real problem with Syria. Not that the US lost, but that it was never clear what winning even looked like. Here's the thing nobody says out loud, not in Washington, not in Brussels, not in Beijing. The most powerful military in the history of human civilization, the one that spends $500 billion a year, that deploys technology no other nation can touch, has spent 80 years losing wars to farmers, guerrillas, and broke socialist governments. That's not a political statement. That's the record. And the uncomfortable truth isn't that America keeps losing. It's that America keeps being surprised that it's losing. The first time a nation fails, it's bad luck. The second time, it's a pattern. The fifth time, it's a belief system. Vietnam, Cuba, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. Each one entered with fresh confidence. Each one defended with the same logic. The mission is necessary. The technology is superior. The cause is just. Each one ended the same way. In Vietnam, it didn't. The Viet Cong had no air force, no tanks, no advanced weapons. They had tunnels, determination, and home advantage. 58,000 Americans died before Washington accepted what military historians had been saying since the French lost in 1954. Ideology and terrain beat technology when the will to fight is asymmetric. In Iraq, it couldn't. Democracy is not a software installation. You cannot airdrop institutions into a society that hasn't built them organically. The Iraqi government the US installed was immediately fractured by sectarian divisions between Sunni, Shia, and Kurdish factions, divisions that Saddam had suppressed by force for decades. Removing the force didn't create unity. It created a vacuum. In Afghanistan, it didn't. 20 years of presence, investment, and institution building produced an Afghan army that collapsed in 11 days when US air support was removed. The lesson: if a government can only survive with foreign military backing, it isn't a government, it's an occupation in a suit. None of these were intelligence failures. The intelligence was often there. The soldiers often knew. When Marine Sergeant Brian McGinnis openly pushed back during an Armed Services Subcommittee hearing on potential new military action in Iran, he wasn't alone. Veterans, military analysts, and battlefield commanders have repeatedly flagged the gap between Washington's strategic assumptions and ground-level reality. The problem isn't information. The problem is that institutions rarely update their self-image when confronted with evidence that contradicts it. Empires don't think this might be wrong. They think not enough has been tried yet. This pattern has a historical precedent. At its peak in 1920, the British Empire controlled roughly 24% of the world's land surface and governed over 400 million people. It had the most powerful navy on Earth, the most sophisticated financial system, the most extensive global trade network. Within 30 years, it was largely gone. Not because Britain was defeated militarily, but because the model stopped working. Maintaining an empire became more expensive than the empire produced. Colonial populations stopped consenting to be governed, and the assumptions that had justified expansion, that British rule was inherently beneficial, that resistance was aberration rather than signal. Those assumptions never updated. The global question being asked today is America's 80-year cycle of dominance following the same arc? China's GDP has grown from roughly $1.2 trillion in 2000 to over $17 trillion today. Russia, despite sanctions and international isolation, remains a nuclear power with significant regional Iran's regional network, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Houthis in Yemen, militias in Iraq and Syria, has expanded despite decades of U.S. pressure and sanctions. America's traditional European allies, once automatic supporters, now run their own strategic calculations. The world America built after 1945 is no longer a given. It's a negotiation. Here's the important counterpoint, and it matters. Not every American strategic commitment failed. South Korea today is the 12th largest economy in the world, a democracy, a technology powerhouse. The U.S. defense commitment there, sustained, consistent, and backed by a genuine Korean government with popular legitimacy, has held for 70 years. Japan's post-World War II reconstruction, guided significantly by American policy, produced one of the most successful economic turnarounds in history. The difference? In South Korea and Japan, America was a partner, not a ruler. It provided security while local governments built legitimacy. It didn't try to install values at gunpoint. The missions that worked had two things in common. First, a local government with genuine popular support. Second, a clearly defined, limited strategic objective. The missions that failed had the opposite. Governments propped up by American force, and objectives that kept expanding until nobody could define what victory meant. Power and wisdom are not the same thing. The United States has the most powerful military on Earth, and it has lost or failed to achieve its objectives in nearly every major conflict of the last 70 years. That is not a contradiction. That is a lesson about the difference between force and understanding. The nations that endure across centuries are not always the ones with the biggest weapons budget. They're the ones that can accurately see themselves, their limits, their blind spots, their role in a world that is always changing. There's a concept in systems thinking called a feedback loop. When you touch a hot stove and pull your hand back, that's a feedback loop working. When you touch it again and again, expecting a different result, that's a feedback loop ignored. Vietnam was feedback. Cuba was feedback. Iraq was feedback. Afghanistan was feedback. The question, not just for America, but for every nation, every institution, every leader watching this moment in history, is whether the pattern gets recognized before the cost of ignoring it becomes irreversible. America still has that chance. The infrastructure, the innovation, the alliances, frayed but not broken. But it starts with the willingness to look at the scorecard honestly, not as failure.